When you open Instagram and scroll post, the app does not store all data inside your phone. So it basically send a request to server using API, and the server send data back, and Instagram show it on your screen, right? And then the same thing happens to YouTube, WhatsApp, Amazon, Swiggy, or any banking apps, right? But how exactly front end and back end talk to each other? That is what APIs do. Now the question comes here: what is an API? So the API stand for Application Programming Interface. In simple term, API is basically a messenger between two systems. For example, so you have a front end, and front end asks for data, and then the API take that request to the server process it, and it returns to the API returns to the front end again, right? So that is what the overall structure of API, right? So let's understand a real world analogy. Imagine you go to the restaurant. So you imagine as yourself as a client, and waiter is API. So when you ask waiter, I need this food, waiter waiter went to the kitchen, and kitchen, that basically is a server where they process all these things, they build the food, and then when everything is done, then the waiter, the API, it takes the food and come back to you. That is what the response is basically, and this is what the API does, right? So in simple term, you order food, waiter take request, kitchen prepare the food, and waiter brings response, right? And that's what the API work exactly like this, right? Now the next thing comes here, that is client server architecture. So client server architecture means the application requesting data. For example, it could be a React app, it could be a mobile app, or it could be a browser, right? And then comes the server. So server is where logic and data exist. That basically process request, connect database, and send a response to the API again. And API again sends the response to the client, right? Now there comes another important things, that is request and response cycle. This is very important. So the question comes here, why the request is very important. So suppose when front end wants something and it send a request, right? For example, you have written in API get forward slash following by users. So it went to the server, and it will go and it asks the database, or it asks the server, give me all the listed user. Suppose in the in particular endpoint, that get following by users, in that particular endpoint you have written, give me all the users that exist in a database. And what happened, it basically it gives you when API's request to the server, it process the data, and it will get all this data from the user tables, and it will give you the data, right? So basically it receive a request, process the logic, and check the database, and prepare your response, right? Then there comes response. So when server send the response to data, so it basically receive data, or any kind of status code or message. That is what a response means. It could be in any format, it could be in a text format, it could be a JSON format, and either it could be error. Suppose you ask something and that does not exist in a server, so so the server will give a API a response that this data doesn't exist, and then API will tell you that this whatever you have requested, that is not available to the server. That is what the response is. Now the question comes here. There is another term that is called JSON. We're not going to deep dive into that things, but let me explain a bit. So the JSON is basically that is stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and JSON is the language of API to use communicate, because it is very lightweight, and it is easy to read, easy to send over internet, and supported everywhere, right? And JSON is basically that contain the key value pair, and it also contain the array, it also contain the object, right? Now moving forward from the JSON, there is another important term, and I'm 100% sure that everyone who is a developer had heard about these things. That basically what is REST API. So REST is a standard way of building API. REST API use basically HTTP method, URLs, and JSON response. For example, when you write your API, you write something like get forward slash user, post forward slash user, put forward slash user forward slash 10, or delete forward slash user forward slash 10. These kind of things you can define in your own, right? And so let me explain the what get, post, and put delete does. So basically get fetch the data from the server, and post basically create the data, or it used to send the data to the server, and put basically to update the data, and delete to remove anything that you wanted to delete from the database, right? So we will deeply learn all method in upcoming videos. So and that is what the REST API is. Basically it works in a HTTP method, URL, and a JSON response. And there comes the new thing, that is stateless API, and this confuse almost every beginners. So stateless means server does not remember previous request automatically. Suppose if a user sends get forward slash by profile, server only knows current request. It does not remember any previous request or response unless there is a token, session, or cookie are used. Right? That is what the stateless stateless API is. Right? So let's understand with example. Suppose we have a front end, and we know the fetch API that we already know how to read it in a JavaScript or a React, and we put it over there that there is we use fetch, and then it give us the response, and we basically use that data. But when it comes to the calling the API, we write something like, suppose HTTP, and if you have a domain, then you write like something HTTPS forward slash by domain, and then forward slash by API. But if you don't have, and you have created all these things on local database, local systems, then you call basically HTTP forward slash localhost, and then forward slash by users, right? So it basically sending a request, and when request comes, you can either convert in a JSON, or you can convert in a text. I mean, whatever the preferable way for you, you can convert it, and then you can receive the data, and you can display the data to the user, or whatever you wanted to do, you can do. So there is a lot of real world example that basically exactly work the same way. For example, Instagram app, Swiggy app, Zomato app, and banking system that basically also work in the same way. And and nowadays everyone use all API, right? There is also the third API that basically we called as external API. For example, if you want to fetch your if you want to embed your Google Maps in your Google Maps, or you want to track everything, how all these things, like how you are sending something. So like if you take example, suppose you order food in a Swiggy, and you see where the delivery rider is, right? That basically they use Google Maps API. In the same way they use weather API, payment gateway API, right? How you pay instantly, and money got transferred to another bank account, right? Nowadays the chat GPT API has been very famous. Almost every developer nowadays are embedding using that API, and they are calling their own LLM model, right? So instead of building everything yourself, you can use API from another company, right? Now the question comes here, why API are important? So API are the backbone of any modern application. Without API, frontend cannot get data, mobile app cannot work, and payment system fails, authentication fails. You cannot control that who have been logged into the system, who have not. everyone will get the access of that particular system, right? So so the real project flow is when you build any project, you have built, suppose you have a front end and that you have built in a React, Angular, or any kind of project, any kind of front end framework, or it could be HTML, CSS, normal, any programming language. You suppose you use React, then you have a middleware that is called API, and then call the backend, that is you have written to get the data from the API, that whatever the your front end has requested to the to the backend, and then backend connect to the database. It could be a Postgre database, it could be MongoDB, whatever the database you have, and then it pre-process the data and then send it back to the API, and API send it back to the React, right? Now there is a some common mistakes that every beginner makes. That first is API is not database, API is not backend itself, and JSON is not API, and front end does not directly talk to the database, right? So let's see a example. I have a public API. So this is what the API is, right? We have a domain that is called JSON placeholder.type typecode.com and then / by user. This is your endpoint users, right? And now when we click on this, when we enter this, it will send a request, and then server will get to that, and then it returns JSON, right? This is what the API does, right? So and that's it for this video. In the next video, we will start creating a real API route, and we understand HTTP method deeply, like a get, post, put, and delete, and we'll create our customs, and we'll test everything using it could be Postman or it could be Thunder client. Yeah, and that's it for this video. So if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe the channel, and we'll see you into the next one. Thank you.